You see the pristine countertops, the minimalist art, the view over the city most people only dream of. You see the framed photo on the bedside table, a smiling couple, him in his surgical scrubs, me looking, well, content. That's what it was, right? Contentment. Or at least the perfect illusion of it. He gave me this apartment, this life, this security. Eric. Dr. Eric Thorne. A man who held lives in his hands, who commanded respect with this quiet intensity. He gave me everything a woman is supposed to want. So why did I throw it all away? Why did I burn that perfect picture down for a fleeting feeling, a ghost of a thrill with a man from my past? They say the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. My life? It was a floodlight of success, of supposedly having it all. But in that blinding glare, I was fading, becoming invisible, even to myself. And then, a message, like a digital whisper from a time when I felt, well, seen. It was my old university professor, Daniel. And that's when the carefully built facade of my perfect life started to crack. This isn't a story about a villain or a victim. This is the story of how I, Claire, systematically dismantled my own happiness, and why, in the quiet, desolate aftermath, I'm finally forced to stare at the wreckage. Eric and I met in a way that sounds like the opening scene of a rom-com. I was a junior curator at a small gallery. He was a resident, overworked, but with this captivating focus. He'd come to an evening exhibit, looking for a moment of quiet, or so he said. We talked for hours. He wasn't like the other men I'd dated. There was a seriousness to him, a gravitas, but also this surprisingly gentle side he rarely showed the world. Our courtship was a whirlwind, really, squeezed in around the demands of his fast-growing career. Marriage just felt like the natural, inevitable next step. And the life he gave me, objectively speaking, it was incredible. Our apartment was a testament to modern elegance, all clean lines and muted colors, a calm sanctuary high above the noisy city. He was a brilliant surgeon, climbing the ranks with a speed that was both awe-inspiring and, I later realized, completely all-consuming. His dedication? It was truly something to behold. Patients adored him, colleagues respected him. He was good, genuinely good at what he did. He saved lives. How could I ever compete with that? How could my own desires, my increasingly vague feelings of unhappiness, ever stack up against the sheer importance of his work? He was a good man, dependable, honest in his own way. He never lied about his work, about the hours. He never pretended it would be easy. Medicine's a demanding mistress, he'd say, sometimes with a wry smile, sometimes with a weariness that settled deep in his eyes. I understood, or I told myself I did. I played the supportive wife. I managed our home, our social life, which, let's be honest, mostly revolved around hospital fundraisers and dinners with other medical people. I tried to carve out a little space for myself within the huge shadow his career cast. But the silence in that perfect apartment, it just grew. It started subtly. His late nights became the norm, not the exception. The few hours he was home, he was often exhausted, his mind still in the operating room, replaying procedures, worrying about patients. The conversations we used to have, the ones that first drew me to him, dwindled to purely logistical exchanges. Did you pick up the dry cleaning? Don't forget the Henderson dinner on Friday. I'll be late, don't wait up. He was physically there sometimes, but his emotional presence, that felt like a luxury we couldn't afford anymore, or rather, one he couldn't afford to give. I tried. I really, really did. I'd plan romantic dinners that would just get cold on the table. I'd buy new lingerie that stayed in the drawer. I'd suggest weekends away that would almost always get canceled because of some surgical emergency. Each rejection, each postponed plan, each tired sigh when I tried to connect, it was just another brick in the wall going up between us. I wasn't angry, not back then. It was more of a slow, creeping numbness, a chilling realization that I just wasn't a priority anymore. I was an accessory to his life. The well-dressed, well-spoken wife of the brilliant surgeon, a supporting character. The loneliness was the worst part. It was this insidious ache, a hollowness in my chest that no amount of shopping or charity work or gallery openings could fill. I remember standing by our floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering city, and feeling so utterly, completely alone. Surrounded by beauty, by luxury, yet an island. I had friends, sure, but they all saw the perfect life, the successful husband. How could I explain this yawning emptiness to them without sounding ungrateful, or worse, pathetic? My surgeon husband gave me everything, I'd think. And the unspoken part was always, so what right do you possibly have to be unhappy? I tried talking to Eric a few times. In the beginning, he'd be apologetic, promised to make more time, but the demands of his job were just relentless. He was driven by this need to achieve, to heal, and maybe to escape into a world where he was in complete control, where his skill made a clear difference. Our home life, with its messy emotions and unspoken needs, was probably too chaotic, too unpredictable for him after a 16-hour day wrestling with life and death. As time went on, my attempts to connect were met with this kind of weary impatience. Like my needs were just another burden he couldn't carry. "Claire, you know what my life is like," he'd say, not unkindly, but with a finality that just shut down any more discussion. So I stopped trying. I retreated into myself. I became a ghost in my own marriage, haunting the beautiful rooms of our perfect apartment. I smiled at the right times, said the right things, played the part. But inside, I was drying up, like a flower pressed between the pages of a life that wasn't really mine. The resentment started to take root then, a small bitter seed. It wasn't the explosive anger you see in movies. It was a quiet, simmering bitterness, a constant companion to the loneliness. He had everything from me, my support, my youth, my going along with his life. And what did I have? A beautiful cage. I found myself looking back more than forward, thinking about times when I'd felt vibrant, when I'd felt like the main character in my own story. Before Eric. Before the perfectly curated existence, before all the silence. And that's when the past, in the most unexpected way, reached out. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Rain was hammering against the apartment windows, the city a watercolor blur outside. Eric was, as usual, at the hospital. I was just adrift, scrolling aimlessly through social media, a digital voyeur peering into other people's seemingly vibrant lives. Then a notification popped up, a message request from a name I hadn't seen in years, Daniel Weatherly. My heart did this strange little flip. Professor Weatherly. Daniel. He'd been my art history professor in my final year of university nearly a decade ago. He wasn't handsome in that classic way Eric was, with his sharp features. Daniel was, well, charismatic. He had this way of talking about art, about passion, about life, that made everything feel charged with meaning. His classes were electric. He had this way of looking at you, a direct, knowing gaze that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, that he saw something special in you. I, like probably half the women in his course, had a massive unspoken crush on him. It was an intellectual crush, of course. Or, so I told myself. He was married, older, my professor. Totally unattainable. But he'd encouraged my own artistic pursuits, things I'd long since abandoned. He'd told me I had a unique eye, a sensitivity that was rare. For a short, intoxicating time, he'd made me feel like I was bursting with potential. And now, here was his name on my screen. My fingers hovered over the accept button. Why now, after all this time? Curiosity, that dangerous flickering flame, won out. I opened the message. "Claire? Claire Mitchell, is that you? It's Daniel Weatherly. Long time. I stumbled across your profile. A mutual connection, it seems. How are you? It was harmless enough. Friendly, even. I typed back a polite, maybe slightly guarded reply. Daniel, yes, it's me. Wow, it has been a long time. I'm doing well, thank you. Married, living in the city? And you? His reply came quickly. Still teaching, still trying to corrupt young minds with beauty and meaning, he wrote, and I could almost hear his familiar, slightly ironic tone. Also in the city, as it happens. Divorced, actually, a few years now. Divorced. The word just hung there. We exchanged a few more messages that afternoon, polite catch-ups, reminiscing about a few old university stories. It felt harmless. A little spark of connection in an otherwise gray day. He asked what I was doing, and I told him about my previous work in galleries, vaguely mentioning I wasn't working in the field right now. I didn't go into the why, the slow death of my own ambitions in the face of Eric's all-consuming career. A shame, he wrote. You had such a keen insight. The art world needs more people like you. His words, simple as they were, felt like a balm on a wound I hadn't even realized was still so raw. Someone remembered me. Someone saw that potential I thought had shriveled up long ago. It was a dangerous feeling, that validation from an outside source. Over the next few weeks, the messages became more frequent. We talked about art, books, films, the kinds of conversations I craved, the kinds I just didn't have with Eric anymore. Daniel was witty, engaging, and he asked questions about me. My thoughts, my opinions, my sleeping dreams. He remembered details about essays I'd written, comments I'd made in class years ago. It was intoxicating, being the focus of that kind of attentive interest. He never directly criticized my life, but he had a way of asking questions that made me question it myself. So, what does the brilliant Claire Mitchell do with her days now, surrounded by all that concrete and glass? He'd ask. Or, are you still painting? You had such a distinctive style. Each question was like a subtle little poke at the gilded bars of my cage. I started looking forward to his messages, a little thrill shooting through me when his name popped up. It was an escape. A secret world where I wasn't just Dr. Thorne's wife, but Claire. Interesting, insightful Claire. I told myself it was just friendship, a harmless intellectual flirtation. I barely mentioned Eric to him, and when I did, it was just in passing, usually to explain why I was free to chat or not. Daniel didn't pry about my marriage, not directly, but he listened. And in his listening, I felt this unspoken understanding, a sense of shared disillusionment, perhaps, given his own divorce. I knew on some level I was playing with fire, that this secret correspondence was a betrayal of sorts, an emotional infidelity that was starting to bloom. But I rationalized it. Eric was never home, always working. He wouldn't even notice. And what was the harm in a few messages? I deserved a little bit of attention, didn't I? A little intellectual stimulation? My justifications were already lining up, the slick, easy arguments of a mindset on getting what it wanted. The emptiness inside me was like a vacuum, and Daniel's attention was rushing in to fill it. I was starting to feel something again, even if that something was tinged with deceit. And that feeling, that dangerous, intoxicating flicker of life, was becoming addictive. The digital intimacy with Daniel just grew, slowly at first, then with a kind of momentum that both thrilled and terrified me. Our messages changed from nostalgic chats and intellectual sparring into something more personal, more confessional. He'd share frustrations about his work, the loneliness of his life after divorce. I, in turn, found myself revealing little bits of my own unhappiness, not in a flood of complaints about Eric, but in carefully worded hints about my quiet life, my unfulfilled creative side, the sense of being adrift. He was a sharp listener, always validating, always understanding. "I hear you, Claire," he'd type. And those 3 words felt more comforting than anything Eric had said to me in years. The suggestion to meet for coffee came from him, casually dropped into a conversation about a new exhibition he thought I'd like. "We could even critique it together like old times," he'd written, a winking emoji attached. My stomach did a complicated flip. This was the line. Crossing it meant stepping out of the abstract world of online messages into the real, tangible world of an in-person meeting. It meant admitting that this was more than just harmless messages. I hesitated for a whole day. I drafted a dozen polite no thank yous in my head. But the pull was too strong. The thought of an actual conversation, of seeing that engaged look in his eyes again, of feeling like the interesting, vibrant Claire he seemed to remember. It was like a siren song. I was already so emotionally distant from Eric. This felt like a logical, if forbidden, next step in finding the connection I was starving for. "I'd like that," I typed back, my heart hammering. That first meeting was electric. We met at a small cafe, tucked away on a side street, far from any neighborhood Eric or I went to. Seeing him again after all those years was strange. He was older, of course, lines around his eyes and a touch of gray at his temples, but that same intensity was there, that spark in his gaze when he looked at me. And he looked at me, really looked, not through me, not past me, but at me. The conversation just flowed, like it had online. We talked for hours. He made me laugh, genuinely laugh, something I realized I hadn't done in a very long time. He asked about my art, not just if I was still doing it, but what? I wanted to express what my passions were. He listened, truly listened, his head tilted, his eyes holding mine. It felt like a parched plant finally getting water. I felt myself unfurling, becoming animated, vibrant. For those few hours, I wasn't Eric's wife, the ghost in the perfect apartment. I was just Claire, a woman with thoughts, ideas, and a forgotten creative soul that Daniel seemed determined to reawaken. I lied to Eric, of course. The first of many big lies. I told him I was meeting an old college friend for lunch. It slipped out so easily, too easily. The guilt was a dull throb easily shoved aside by the intoxicating high of Daniel's attention. This became the pattern. Coffee meetings turned into lunches, then long afternoon conversations over a shared bottle of wine. Each meeting was a carefully planned deception. I had a separate email address for our messages, a silent phone setting for his texts. I became meticulous about deleting call logs, covering my tracks. The energy I put into managing the secrecy was immense. It was like a twisted kind of creativity in itself. At home, the distance between Eric and me hardened into a cold, unspoken truth. His long hours continued. His exhaustion was a constant presence. Sometimes I almost wished he would notice the change in me, the subtle new confidence, the private smiles, the way I hummed to myself sometimes. But he didn't. Or if he did, he put it down to something else, something that didn't involve him, and so didn't need his attention. His obliviousness, which once hurt me, now became a shield for my deceit. It made it easier to justify what I was doing. He didn't care enough to notice, so why should I feel guilty? The resentment festered, twisting my logic. Daniel never pushed me physically. He was a master of the slow burn, the emotional seduction. He'd compliment my dress or the way my eyes lit up when I talked about something I was passionate about. He'd occasionally let his hand brush mine when making a point, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through me. He was creating this world of intimacy and shared secrets, a cocoon where I felt cherished and alive. He was everything Eric wasn't, attentive, emotionally available, and seemingly fascinated by every part of me. The internal conflict was a constant churning thing, but I got good at silencing that voice of reason, the nagging guilt. I was chasing a feeling, the feeling of being seen, of being desired, of being alive. It was a powerful drug, and Daniel was the one supplying it. I knew what I was doing was wrong, destructive even, but the alternative, going back to the silent, empty life with Eric, felt like a slow death. So, I chose the vibrant, dangerous path. The inevitable happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. We'd gone to a gallery, then for a long walk in the park. The conversation had been particularly deep, touching on regrets, on paths not taken. There was this unspoken tension simmering between us, a charge in the air. He walked me to a quiet, tree-lined street near my apartment, though not too near. As we stood there, the silence stretched, filled with everything unsaid. He looked at me, that intense, searching gaze, and then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a savage kiss, but it was loaded with all the longing and forbidden desire that had been building for months. And I kissed him back, with a hunger that shocked me. In that moment, there was no thought of Eric, no thought of my marriage, no thought of the consequences. There was only Daniel and the overwhelming, intoxicating feeling of being utterly, completely wanted. That kiss was the point of no return. The emotional affair had now definitely crossed into the physical. The secret meetings intensified, moving from public cafes to the privacy of his apartment. A cozy, slightly bohemian place filled with books and art, so different from the sterile perfection of my home. The sex was a revelation, not just physically, but emotionally. With Daniel, I felt desired for me, not for the role I played. He was attentive, passionate, and he made me feel beautiful, something I hadn't felt in years. It was a stark contrast to the increasingly rare and almost mechanical encounters I'd had with Eric, which had become more about a sense of marital duty than any real connection. The lies to Eric grew more elaborate, more frequent. I was a master of deception, creating a whole separate life. The guilt was still there, a persistent shadow, but it was overshadowed by the thrill, the forbidden excitement, the feeling of reclamation. I was reclaiming a part of myself I thought was lost, or so I told myself. I framed it as an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to escape the emotional desert of my marriage. I was, in my own story, a victim of circumstance, of Eric's neglect. The bitterness I felt towards Eric became a justification for my actions. He had, in my mind, pushed me into this. He hadn't seen me, so I found someone who would. It was convenient, self-serving logic, and I clung to it. Eric, wrapped up in his demanding world, stayed oblivious. There were moments, fleeting instances, where I thought he might suspect. A questioning look when I was late home, a comment about me seeming distracted. But he never pushed. He was too tired, too consumed by his own pressures. His lack of suspicion, his continued faith in me, should have hit me with profound shame. Instead, I twisted it into further proof of his detachment, his lack of care. It fed my narrative. It made the betrayal easier to bear. I was sinking deeper and deeper into a mess of my own making, all while telling myself I was finally breathing free. The high was exhilarating. The fall I knew would be devastating. But I wasn't ready to face that, not yet. The affair with Daniel went on for the better part of a year. A whole year of stolen moments, whispered confessions, and a carefully built double life. I got bolder, maybe more reckless, drunk on the sense of freedom and Daniel's intoxicating attention. The constant vigilance, the lies, the fear of discovery, it all fueled this strange, manic energy. I was living on the edge, and a part of me, a self-destructive part I hadn't known existed, seemed to almost thrive on it. But secrets have a way of festering, of getting heavy. The thrill started to wear thin around the edges, replaced by this gnawing anxiety. Daniel, for all his charm and attentiveness, had his own issues. He was, I started to see, a man who enjoyed the chase, the intellectual conquest, maybe more than the reality of a long-term thing. There were subtle shifts in his behavior, moments of possessiveness, flashes of a temper I hadn't seen before. The perfect understanding confidant was starting to show cracks, or maybe I was just beginning to see him more clearly, beyond the intoxicating haze of my own needs. The end didn't come as a sudden explosion, but more like a slow, inevitable crumbling. Eric wasn't stupid. He was just preoccupied and, I still believe, genuinely trusting. But even the most preoccupied person will eventually notice when the ground under their feet is constantly shifting. It was a series of small things. An unexplained credit card charge for a restaurant I'd claimed to visit with a girlfriend who was actually out of town. My increasing defensiveness when he asked simple questions about my day. My phone, once casually left around, was now perpetually glued to my hand or hidden away. He started watching me, a new, troubled expression in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. The air in our pristine apartment grew thick with unspoken suspicions. The actual confrontation happened on a cold November evening. I'd just come back from an afternoon with Daniel, my cheeks still flushed from the cold and the illicit thrill. I walked into the living room, and Eric was there, standing by the window, not looking out at the city lights, but staring at a small, ordinary-looking object in his hand. My blood ran cold. It was a silk scarf, one Daniel had given me, one I thought I'd carefully hidden in the back of my closet. I must have dropped it, or he must have been looking for something. He turned, his face impossible to read, a mask of calm that was far more terrifying than any shouting would have been. "Whose is this, Claire?" he asked, his voice quiet, without its usual warmth. My mind raced, desperately trying to cook up a plausible lie. But looking at his face, at the deep hurt already settling in his eyes, I knew the time for lies was over. The intricate web of deceit I had so carefully woven was about to be ripped apart. It's mine," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I've never seen it before," he stated, still calm, but with a tremor underneath. "And it certainly isn't something I bought you." He paused, then, "Where were you this afternoon, Claire?" The usual alibi died on my lips. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. Not as the obstacle to my happiness, not as the source of my loneliness, but as my husband. The man I had once loved, the man I had vowed to cherish. And in his eyes, I saw not just suspicion, but a dawning, devastating pain. The truth just spilled out, not all at once, not in a neat story, but in broken phrases, choked sobs, and damning admissions. I told him about Daniel, about the messages, the meetings, the affair. I didn't try to justify it, not then. The carefully built reasons, the bitter resentments, they all crumbled in the face of his raw, unfiltered agony. He listened, his face growing paler with every word. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. That, somehow, was worse. His silence was like a gaping wound. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and hollow, he just stood there, the scarf still clutched in his hand, looking at me as if I were a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse. "How could you?" Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of our entire marriage, of all the broken promises and shattered trust. "How could you do this to us? To me?" I had no answer. All the justifications I'd cooked up, all the blame I'd subtly tried to shift onto him for his emotional absence, it all felt like ash in my mouth. In that moment, I saw the full extent of the devastation I'd caused. I saw the pain I had inflicted, not just on him, but on the life we had built, however imperfect it had been. The conversation that followed, and the ones in the days and weeks after, were brutal. There was anger then, of course. Cold, cutting anger from Eric, mixed with periods of profound, heartbreaking sadness. He asked questions I couldn't bear to answer, questions about details, about feelings, about how I could have been so deceitful for so long. Each question was like another turn of the knife. Our perfect apartment, once a symbol of our success, became a battleground, then a tomb. We were like 2 ghosts haunting its beautiful rooms, the silence now thick with pain and betrayal, no longer just the quiet of absence. The life I had resented for its emptiness was now filled with an agony that was almost unbearable. There was no escape from the consequences, no thrill to mask the reality of what I had done. The high was gone. This was the crash. And it was every bit as devastating as I had, in some dark corner of my mind, always known it would be. The weeks after the discovery were a blur of pain, accusations, and the slow, agonizing death of our marriage. Eric, understandably, was shattered. The man I knew, the calm, controlled surgeon, was replaced by someone I barely recognized. A man hollowed out by betrayal, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and a deep, wounded sorrow. Sleep became a stranger to both of us. The nights were the worst, filled with an oppressive silence or punctuated by hushed, anguished arguments that left us both raw and exhausted. He moved into the guest room. The physical distance between us was a chasm, mirroring the emotional abyss that had opened up. Our beautiful apartment, once a symbol of stability and aspiration, now felt like a prison. Each carefully chosen piece of furniture a mocking reminder of the life I had systematically destroyed. The practicalities of separation started to creep in, cold and stark amid the emotional turmoil. Lawyers were called. Finances were dissected. The life we had built together was being itemized, valued, and prepared for division. It was a brutal, dehumanizing process. And Daniel, the catalyst for all this destruction? Our affair, which had seemed so vibrant and alive in its secrecy, couldn't stand up to the harsh glare of reality. When I confessed to Eric, a part of me, a foolish, naive part, maybe expected Daniel to be something. A support, a comfort, a partner in this new terrifying chapter. Instead, when I told him what had happened, his reaction was underwhelming, to say the least. There was sympathy, sure, but it was distant, almost detached. He was worried about his own reputation, about the potential for drama, as he put it. The passionate, attentive lover who had made me feel like the center of his universe started to pull away. His messages became less frequent, his calls shorter. The man who had so eagerly pursued me, who had encouraged my unhappiness, now seemed desperate to distance himself from the messy fallout of what we'd done. It was a harsh, painful lesson. I had chased a feeling, an illusion of being seen and desired. Daniel had provided that, but it was a fleeting, conditional thing. He had enjoyed the thrill of the forbidden, the intellectual and emotional seduction of a woman who felt neglected. But the reality of a life turned upside down, of genuine emotional entanglement beyond the carefully curated meetups, that wasn't part of the fantasy he, or maybe I, had built. The affair, born from my emptiness and his opportunism, just crumbled under the weight of real-world consequences. It ended not with a bang, but with a pathetic, cowardly whimper from his end, and a dawning, bitter realization on mine. I had traded my marriage, my security, my entire life, for something that was ultimately as hollow as the emptiness I'd been trying to escape. Losing Eric was one thing. Losing the life he'd provided was another. The apartment, the financial security, the social standing that came with being Mrs. Thorne. It all just evaporated. I had to move out, find a small, sterile rental on the outskirts of the city, a place that felt as empty as I did. The friends we shared, mostly his colleagues and their spouses, quietly, predictably, sided with him. I was the villain in their story, the ungrateful wife who had thrown away a perfect life. And maybe they were right. From where they stood, how could they see the invisible cracks, the silent despair that had led me down this path? The loneliness now was different. It wasn't the quiet, aching loneliness of an unfulfilling marriage. It was the stark, desolate loneliness of self-inflicted isolation. I had chased a feeling to escape being a ghost in my own life, and in doing so, I'd made myself a pariah. The bitterness I had once aimed at Eric for his emotional absence now turned inward, a corrosive self-loathing. I'd been so focused on what I wasn't getting from my marriage that I failed to see what I was destroying, not just for him, but for myself. The perfect apartment, the designer clothes, the dinners at exclusive restaurants, they were all gone. But the loss was more than material. It was the loss of structure, of identity, however flawed that identity had been. I was no longer Dr. Thorne's wife. I was Claire, just Claire. And I had no idea who that was anymore, stripped bare of the fancy extras of my former life and the intoxicating illusion of Daniel's affection. The phrase, "it cost me everything," just echoed in my mind. My husband, my home, my financial security, my reputation, the fragile fantasy I'd built with Daniel, all gone, traded for a temporary break from an internal ache, a break that had turned out to be a mirage. The charismatic professor was a footnote, a painful reminder of my own foolishness. The dependable surgeon was a ghost from a life I had torched. The only constant was the gnawing emptiness, now magnified by regret and the harsh reality of my choices. The price of chasing that lost feeling was steep, and I was only just beginning to understand the full bill I had to pay. Months have passed since everything blew up. The divorce is finalized, the dust has settled, not into a comfortable peace, but into a stark, barren landscape of my own making. I live in a small apartment now, one that feels more like a holding cell than a home. The vibrant colors of my life with Eric, even the muted, sophisticated tones of our shared apartment, have been replaced by a dull, monotonous gray. The city view is gone, replaced by a brick wall. It's a fitting metaphor, I guess. Who am I now? That's the question that haunts my sleepless nights and hollow days. I'm not Mrs. Eric Thorne, the surgeon's wife. I'm not Daniel Weatherly's exciting, illicit lover. Those roles, those identities have been stripped away. What's left is just Claire. A woman I barely know, a woman I'm not sure I like very much, if I'm honest. The anger I once felt towards Eric for his emotional unavailability, the bitterness that was such a convenient excuse for my actions, has largely faded. In its place is a cold, hard understanding of my own fault in all this. Yes, our marriage was flawed. Yes, I felt unseen and lonely. Those feelings were real. But the choices I made because of those feelings? Those were mine and mine alone. I chose deception over communication. I chose the fleeting thrill of an affair over the hard work of trying to mend what was broken, or the courage to walk away cleanly. I see Eric sometimes, in my mind's eye. The initial rage has probably cooled for him too, maybe replaced by a scar that will never fully heal. I imagine him in our old apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together, perhaps finding his own way to move forward, to rebuild. He deserved better than what I gave him. He deserved honesty at the very least. And Daniel? He's a phantom, a symbol of my own weakness, my own desperate need for validation. The charisma that once dazzled me now seems cheap, manipulative. He saw a vulnerability in me and exploited it, not out of pure evil perhaps, but out of a casual, self-serving opportunism. He was a mirror reflecting my own desires, but the image was distorted, ultimately leading me further away from myself, not closer. He didn't force me. I walked willingly into his web, hungry for the attention he offered. The everything my surgeon husband gave me wasn't just stuff. It was stability. It was a partnership, however strained it became. It was a future I carelessly threw away. I chased a feeling, a fleeting high, because I felt like a ghost in my own life. But the irony is that in trying to feel alive, I became even more of a ghost, more disconnected from any real sense of self or purpose. I wasn't just a ghost in my marriage. I was becoming a ghost to myself, long before Daniel's message ever popped up. His attention was just a temporary painkiller, not a cure. There are days when the weight of regret is crushing, when the what-ifs play on a torturous loop in my head. What if I had tried harder to talk to Eric? What if I had sought therapy? What if I had found the courage to end my marriage honorably, instead of destroying it through betrayal? These questions offer no comfort, only a deeper understanding of my own failings. I started painting again, just tentatively at first. The canvases are filled with stark landscapes, fractured portraits, the colors muted and somber. It's not the vibrant art I once dreamed of creating, but it's honest. It's a reflection of the desolation inside. Maybe this is the beginning of finding Claire again, not the version defined by a husband or a lover, but the one who got lost somewhere along the way. I threw away a life of comfort and security. I hurt a good man, deeply. I embarrassed myself with a fantasy that turned out to be hollow. And for what? To feel something? Well, I feel plenty now. Shame, regret, a profound sense of loss. The cost of chasing that feeling I'd lost was, indeed, everything. And the truly bitter pill is realizing that the feeling I was chasing wasn't out there with another man, or in another life. It had to be found within me. I just looked in all the wrong places, and in doing so, burned down my entire world. The perfect apartment is gone, the surgeon husband is gone, the professor is gone. Only I remain, standing in the rubble, finally forced to see myself clearly. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying and necessary consequence of all.